Welcome back to Z-Speed and thanks for tuning back in. Today we will be installing these Maxpeedingrods Coilovers on this 2.4 liter 2003 to 2007 Honda Accord. So if you're interested in something like that, just stay tuned. Now, as you can see here, we've got a 4-finger gap on this stock Honda Accord front suspension. And on the rear, we've got another large 4-finger gap as well. So we want to improve the stance and handling by adding coilovers to this Honda Accord. Now, when it comes to my daily drivers, I rarely spend a lot of money on aftermarket parts, but I have been looking at some coilovers to lower the stance on the Honda Accord. Now, one of those coilovers I'd looked at was Maxpeedingrods, among others, but I hadn't had a chance to check out the quality yet. But luckily for me, Maxpeedingrods reached out to me and said, hey, are there any parts that you would like to use on your car and review them on your channel? And I said, that's awesome, because I'd just been looking at your coilovers and I'd love to review some. So they sent me out a set of their coilovers for the 03 to 07 Honda Accord, and they run right around $324. We got a little bit of water damage here on this packaging, but hopefully these coilovers survive all this water down here in the southeast. It's been real wet this summer, so hopefully nothing got damaged here, but let's see what's in the box. Now, Maxpeedingrods have been around since 2006, and they have high-performance auto parts including cranks, coilovers, connecting rods, turbochargers, and a variety of other parts. They also have warehouses in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, and all around the world, and they ship out within 24 hours of ordering. Wow, it looks like the packaging kept these coilovers nice and safe. You can see there's no apparent damage from water on the inside of here. And each one of these coils is individually wrapped and looking pristine here. Now, right on top here, it looks like we have a customer service card that tells you a bit more about their company and some of the other parts that they offer. Now, the only thing I couldn't find in this package was the actual installation guide, but that's okay. I'm sure you can go online and get replacements for that if you need those. Now, luckily, we put coilovers on before, and I'm going to show you a step-by-step guide on how to install these into your Honda Accord. Right here, we've got two beautiful looking spanner wrenches here, and now we're going to pop open this coilover and check the quality of the actual product itself. Now, these coilovers have 24-way adjustable dampening. They also have adjustable height, and they have customizable spring rates for street or track use. So the shock body itself seems to be constructed of high quality metal and quite sturdy. The perches are made of anodized aluminum and are very easy to turn. Now, the spring comes preloaded from the factory, but is adjustable if needed. Now, that was the rear coilover. Let's take a look at the front coilover here, and it seems to have the exact same construction as the rear. Nice high quality setup here. Now, it also comes with its own hardware, so we don't have to worry about reusing the hardware. And on top here, you have your adjustable dampener, and it's covered with this little cap to keep it safe here. So that's kind of nice. And let's take a look at the sleeve now real quick. That actually goes into the fork, and it's got a beautiful sleeve here that will keep the fork from slipping up the shock here. So that's really nice. That's a custom setup right there, and I'll show you a little bit more about that later when we install it. So now let's get our car on jack stands. Bam! And once you get it on jack stands, let's go ahead and remove the tires. Boom! And now we're ready to begin the install. Okay, let's get started on the driver's side. And you can see I've cranked my wheel all the way towards the passenger side. That just gives us a little bit of access to these bolts down here. This is a 17 millimeter bolt that holds the fork to the lower control arm. Then you have a 14 millimeter bolt that actually holds the top of the fork to the strut itself. Then if you go up top up here, we've just basically got 5 nuts up here to remove, so it should be pretty easy. You can see we've got 3 nuts holding the actual strut to the frame of the car, and then you have these 2 right here, the strut tower brace to the frame of the car here. So it's pretty easy right there. You've got 5 nuts total, and then down here you've just got 2 bolts down here. So that's all you really have to remove, and we can go ahead and get that strut out of the car. So go ahead and just remove this nut from the 17 millimeter bolt right here, and we'll come back to that bolt. We'll tap that out here in a minute. Once you get that nut off, we're gonna go ahead and move up to this 14 millimeter bolt up here on top. Go ahead and back that out, and that'll come completely out. You can unscrew that, get that out of the way. Now we're ready to tap out that bolt on bottom. So once the bolts tap flush, you can grab a center punch. You can go ahead and use the center punch to knock the bolt the rest of the way out. So just keep tapping it till it comes out. And before you know it, boom, you got the bolt out. Now at this point, I noticed that the knuckle is really close to the strut itself. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and release the knuckle from the upper control arm, and it's just one 17 millimeter castle nut that we need to break loose. Make sure you take your cotter pin off before you remove the bolt, and just throw that away because we'll have to use a new cotter pin. This thing comes off pretty easily. It will usually kind of be stuck on there, so you could either use a ball peen or a rubber mallet to break it loose. That one came loose pretty easy. The other one was a little bit tougher, so you may have to use a ball joint separator if it's stuck on there really tightly, but mine came loose pretty easily. So now I just realized that I actually have to remove a 10 mil bolt holding this speed sensor to the side of the knuckle, and it's got a lot of tension on it. So make sure you remove that first before you break the knuckle loose from the upper control arm. So now the knuckle's separated from the upper control arm, the whole suspension drops down, and the fork easily separates from the strut, making life a lot easier for us to remove this strut. And now all we have to do is go up top, remove these 5 nuts, and the strut is easily removed from the car. Make sure you leave a little bit of thread on one of the nuts so the strut doesn't drop down. So grab the strut with your other hand, and then you can go ahead and remove that nut, and the whole assembly will drop down. Now as you're dropping the strut down, make sure you keep it clear of the brake line and the speed sensor line right here. You don't want to damage anything when you drop the strut down. And now we're ready to remove the strut out of the wheel well. Just make sure you don't snag that brake line right there. Just lift it up around it. And that was probably one of the easiest front strut removals I've ever done. So that is awesome. And now we're ready to go ahead and install the coilover. Now, before we place the coilovers in the front of the car, we do need to make some rough calculations on how much we want to drop it. Remember, I started off with about a 4-finger gap, and I wanted to take it down to about a 2-finger gap. So I just basically measured my 4 fingers right here, and that came out to about 75 millimeters. And I really wanted to take it down to about half that, or a little less. So I'm going to take it down to about 30 millimeters here. And so I'm just going to kind of measure that out on my stock suspension, and then lower it by 30 millimeters on my coilover here. So at this point, it's up to your own discretion about how low you want to go with your front suspension. Just really depends on your tire setup. So the main thing to take away here is that you make sure that both of the front coilovers are exactly the same height, so you don't get any uneven ride heights. So after it was all said and done, I really decided to go ahead and just max these coilovers out and just collapse them all the way down. I left a 4 millimeter gap between the 2 collars here. I didn't want them pushed up against each other. So I just made sure I measured both sides, and I made sure I ended up with a 4 millimeter gap for both of them so the ride height would be equal. And now we're ready to go ahead and lock the collars down. And so that's pretty easy. You just take your spanner wrenches here and you're gonna go in opposite directions and just put a little force on there and make sure they're nice and tight. And then your collar's locked in and we can go ahead and install these back in the vehicle. So the larger nuts are 37 foot-pounds and these smaller nuts right here for the strut tower brace are 16 foot-pounds. We've got 37 foot-pounds for the pinch bolt right here. And we also have 43 foot-pounds for the bottom of the fork into the lower control arm. So those are the torque specs for you. Now remember at the beginning of the video I talked about that custom collar right here on the coilover. You can see that it's a nice large collar that will not allow this fork to slide up over the strut body itself, and that's a lot better improvement over the stock configuration. So you can see with this OEM strut, the body is much thinner, and I've actually had one slide through the fork and make contact with the drive axle and cause damage, so the coilover has a much better design. Now at this point I'm using my floor jack to push up on the lower control arm so it'll line up with the fork and then make it very easy to slide that bolt in and then put the nut on there loosely. And now I'm going to go ahead and push up a little bit further so I can actually push that fork flush onto the coilover here. Now once the fork actually taps up against the collar of the coilover, you can stop and then we can go ahead and grab that pinch bolt, slide that in to the fork and then torque that down, and we're all ready to go here. So you can see this is a big improvement over the stock configuration. Now let's get started on the rear suspension now that we're all done with the front of the suspension. And basically it's going to be a little bit simpler. We have a couple nuts up on top, then we have two bolts down here below. So I'm going to show you the bolt that's holding the strut into the knuckle here. Right here is where it's at, and this is a KYB strut in case you're wondering. And then on the other side of the strut, we have a little clip that we need to remove. This is the speed sensor clip. If we remove that, it'll be a little bit easier to get to this other bolt we have to undo. So just take this and we'll pull that out right there. Now that that sensor's out of the way, we can get clear access to this bolt, which will basically free up this little sleeve that's attached to the knuckle, which is also attached to the other side of the end link right here. We can kind of swivel that whole thing out of the way and remove the strut. Okay, let's go ahead and remove this 17 millimeter bolt that runs through the strut. And once you release that, you can see the rear suspension relaxes. And now I'm going to swing around to the other side, remove this speed sensor little clasp, get that out of the way. And I believe this is a 14 millimeter bolt here. And once you break that loose, that comes out pretty quickly. Now this whole little bracket will release and it'll swing out of the way so we can remove the strut. Okay, now we need to remove the back seat, or parts of the back seat, so we can gain access to the struts. And the first thing we're going to do is remove this lower cushion. Now I've already released a little tab on the passenger side, so now I'm going to work on the one behind the driver's side, and I'm going to use this little flathead screwdriver to help me pull the tab, but you may be able to grab it with your fingers and pull straight forward and get it to release, but I couldn't do that, so I'm going to use this little flathead screwdriver. Once you get it in there and pop it loose, then the whole seat will just pop out and you can get that out of your way. So that comes out pretty easily. And then you can just move that out of the way. And now we're going to actually drop the back seat down. And the easiest way to do that is to put your keys in this little key slot between the two speakers back here. Turn that while you're pulling forward on the back seat, and that'll release pretty easily there. So not too hard there. Then we got these little side panels that you need to push up on. And I made it look a little easier than it is because I worked at it for a minute, but just push up on those. You can see this little hook, it'll come loose and then the whole little panel will come off. Once you get the two panels off, one on either side, then we just have this one last little piece here. It's just got two clips holding it on. It's pretty easy to remove that. And now we have clear access to the top of the struts. Once you break those two nuts loose on top, you can grab the strut with your other hand and then slowly lower it down. We want to make sure you don't hit the brake line. It's very close to the end of the strut there. Once you get a good position, just kind of let it rest there. And at this point, I used some painter's tape to put over this part of the wheel well here because I scratched the paint last time I tried to pull these things out. So once you get that taped up, you can go ahead and put a pry bar down here on the lower part of the suspension. Now, the reason I'm using the pry bar is because you really have to flex the suspension to get this strut out. I'm going to show you exactly where I placed it here. Right here is where I've stuck the pry bar. And then once you get it right there, you can go ahead and use your foot to press down while you're grabbing the strut with your hands. You can kind of slip it on by the wheel well here. So you can see I made it look a little easier than it really is probably, but it shouldn't be too hard. Now I'm going to kind of spin the strut to get it away from the end link, and boom, it's out of the vehicle and we're ready to put the new coilovers in. Now, before I place the rear coilover in, I'm going to shorten it as low as it'll go because that's what we did to the front. So I loosened the little collar there and I'm going to spin the body of the coilover down as low as it'll go, and you can see it doesn't take much before I max it out. Now, there's a big difference between the two collars in the front, which is a 4mm gap, versus the rear here. But as you can see, the coilover is a lot shorter than the OEM strut right here. So I'm hoping it's going to, even out front and rear. So I'm just going to loosely put the collar back down so I can spin the bottom of the coilover to get it to line up with the bolt here. So now we're ready to put it back in. But before I do, I didn't tell you that I did this earlier with the front coilovers, but I'm going to spray a little silicone spray around these sleeves here so we don't get any squeaking. I'm not saying you're going to get any squeaking, but I like to do that just to make sure that I don't have any squeaks. So now we're ready to place this thing back in the car. Okay, as you'll notice here, placing these coilovers in is so much easier than removing the OEM suspension because it's just so much shorter, goes in with a breeze. So just maneuver around the end link there, then you're going to kind of push up on the coilover and then line it up with those two holes. And then you want to loosely place the two nuts on there so that the coilover will dangle there for you. Now I'm going to use a small floor jack to push up on the bottom of the suspension here so I can get this thing to line up with the bottom of the coilover here so I can place the bolt through the knuckle and through the coilover here. Now I definitely had to push up really hard on the suspension. You can see it stretching the end link a little bit, but that's what happens when you lower anything. Sometimes parts of the OEM suspension need to be replaced, and I'm thinking later on I'll get some adjustable end links there, but right now I've got it to line up correctly. Even though it's stretching the OEM end links, it still was able to fit in here, so I can go ahead and slide the bolt through the knuckle. And now we're going to go around to the front, and I actually had to use a little bit of a block of wood here to push up on the end link, as you can see here, to get this little sleeve to line up correctly onto the knuckle. So that bolt, the bolt going through the shock is going to come out right there, and then I also have that other small 14mm bolt I need to put back in, but I had to kind of really flex that end link to get everything to line up. Okay, now I just snugged up this bracket bolt right here. That's that 14mm bolt. And now I'm going to torque the bolt through the knuckle and through the coilover to 43 foot-pounds. That's the torque specs for this bolt right here. So once you get that all torqued down, we can go up top, and we're going to torque these two nuts down to 37 foot-pounds. And just lift up on that plastic back there to get to that rear nut right there. And bingo, we're all done with the torque down process, and the rear coilovers are now installed. So before we take it for a test drive, now that we've got it out of the garage and into the sunlight, let's take a look at the stance. You can see it's greatly improved over the stock suspension setup here. We've gotten rid of a lot of that ugly wheel gap, and I'm really happy with the way it looks. So if you remember at the beginning of the video, I had like a 4-finger plus gap, and now I can barely squeeze 2 fingers in here. So that's awesome. It's more like 1.5 on the front. And in the rear, it's about the same thing. Just barely squeezing in 2 fingers. So you can see it's a great improvement over the stock stance, and this should decrease the body roll in the cornering. So now we can take the car out on the street and check the ride quality as well as the cornering abilities, see if anything's changed. Pretty similar to the OEM ride. This is now stiff as it can go in front and rear. We're going to do a little bit of cornering around here. Definitely not bad at all. It's pretty smooth. Considering we're lowered, you know, by 2.5 fingers plus. Nice. Taking these little dips quite well. I'm impressed. We're gonna do a corner. Looking for body roll. Body roll's really improved. Wow, that's nice. Definitely. Good on the cornering. Very good. Coming in, we're gonna brake hard. Whoa, I broke 2. Yeah, not bad. My brakes started to fade on that one. Came in a little hot. Beautiful. Not bad at all. Wow. Here's a sharp one. No body roll. Looking good. Awesome. Really similar to the OEM shock absorbing capacities here. So, a little sunlight there for you. Yeah, definitely for the price, you're not going to beat this. So don't forget to hit that like button if this video helps you decide what type of coilovers to run in your car. And special thanks to Tina from Maxpeedingrods for reaching out to me and supplying me with the coilovers. And until next time, you know what to do. Just keep on